So first, a few words and some resources from that might be of interest to all of you in the audience. Some of you are GI science people. So one, what is SEDAC? We're a data center of NASA. We are managed by season. So yes, we essentially wear two hats. I manage SEDAC as a NASA data center, but I also run a division of the season at the Earth Institute. And so, you know, we've been around for a while at Columbia. Before that, we were in Michigan, season as an institution. And we have a very interdisciplinary staff, as you can see, with very colorful as well. So SEDAC, the elevator spiel is basically, we do all that ground level data that is useful for interpreting remote sensing data. So NASA pays us and funds us because they find it useful for their science and for the world at large to have these kind of globally comparable socioeconomic data sets like population, economic distribution, age distribution, things of this sort. And you'll see that we're also involved in some other kinds of data as well. NASA, you're probably broadly familiar with it. You know, the mission of the Earth Science Data System is basically to provide data that is interactive and interoperable and accessible for research. And they run all these wonderful satellites. What you see is like the yellow ones are in formulation, orange ones are in implementation, and then there's ones that are basically, you know, in their current lifetime, and ones that are essentially extended ops like MODIS, which we keep hoping won't die, because otherwise the whole, you know, infrastructure for Earth science data would kind of crumble, or at least a lot of the support for the work that DACs do. So touch wood, it's going to keep going and keep flying. I won't go into all the mission and things, but I think most of you are familiar with kind of the mission to planet Earth and the idea that NASA actually not just sends people to the moon, but also collects a lot of data about ourselves and about ecosystems. We are one of 12 DACs. The DACs are spread out around the US, probably for political reasons. It's harder to kill a program if every state has a little data center somewhere. And so you can imagine, so there's, you know, cryosphere, NSIDC. I don't know if I can use this mouse to kind of like, okay, so cryosphere, processes and ice sheets and glaciers are all at NSIDC. Land processes, most of you are probably pretty familiar with them, running, doing a lot of the Landsat data, archiving. Ornell is also, you know, in our kind of bailiwick with some human dimensions work, but we're SEDAC and we're up here in New York State. But there's quite a variety of data, and if you want to do searches across DACs, the best place to do that is at search.earthdata.nasa.gov, where you can basically run some pretty sophisticated queries, including you know, spatial bounding boxes and things like that to identify what's available and what might be useful to you. Thanks in part to, you know, Guido, I became more familiar with Giovanni. Sounds like an Italian name, so maybe that's why I got, you know, kind of picked it up from him. But it's they provide a lot of atmospheric data, and you can subset the data, time series, and do some really interesting analyses. He says he uses it as a lab tool. I also really like Appears, which is a data set that basically allows you to extract time series by pixel or by larger areas, and you just submit a request, comes back very quickly, and you can get, say, tree cover or greenness, you know, NDVI over time. You can get land surface temperature over time. You can get a lot of other parameters over time, and we include our population data in these tools. A colleague and I, Susanna Adamo, wrote this little tutorial, which is available through our guides section of our website, where we basically provide for social scientists a tutorial for how to easily extract remote sensing data. And it has become much easier now, I would say, with Google Earth Engine and these tools that NASA has developed to basically do analyses that would have taken you months and months of calibration and atmosphere correction and tiling together individual scenes. For those of you in the remote sensing community, you know how difficult it was. And now it's become so much easier. It does make it easier to do stupid things too, so be careful. With power comes responsibility. So I also co-coordinate this network called the Population Environment Research Network of about 2,500 researchers around the world. It's under Future Earth and the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population, which is sort of the global, like the IGU for demographers. And basically we have a big online database of literature. We have these online cyber seminars. So if you're interested in population environment interactions writ large, the broader issues of human environment interactions, I encourage you to sign up, become a member, it's free of charge, and get our newsletter and things, and you'll learn more. One thing that we started in the last couple of years, partly out of necessity, the world was becoming, the people who were developing population grids, which is one of our mainstays, and you'll see a lot of my research references, gridded population of the world or global rural urban mapping project. These are two kind of major data sets that we've been producing since the 90s and have had successive iterations of. And we realized the community of users was getting very confused. There used to be like 1 or 2 data sets, Landscan and GPW. You had a choice, and if you wanted high resolution, you went with Landscan, or you wanted whatever, certain choice sets were made, or you just used what you saw everyone else using. Now, as there's essentially 6 or 7 global products out there, there's a need for the ability to compare those products, to get more information about those products. So we put together a consortium. It's called a data collaborative, which is the hot new term, which actually involves private sector, data scientists, and users. That's the idea behind a data collaborative. And this is all around population data. So we developed this tool, which is a nice visualization tool, which enables you to pan and zoom and look at the differences of the data products across different geographic areas. And you can also use a single panel viewer and just lasso an area. It's a little hard to see, but I lassoed a part of a little fraction of the Nile Delta. And you can see that across the data products, the population counts are quite different. And so this is a first cut way for you to be able to understand what the products are, there's a lot of methodological and data background on the products so that you can delve into that more. So that's sort of an introduction to some things that may be useful to you all here and to the grad students here and faculty. So I'm going to be talking a bit about research applications of data. I chose to do this rather than give a dog and pony about the data that we produce because I felt that you guys are smart scientists and you'll want to hear something that has a bit more substance. But because it covers a lot of different research that I've been involved in, I've had to sort of condense down whole PowerPoints into 1 or 2 slides. So I'm going to be telegraphing a lot of the methodology, and I'm happy over beer at Whiskers to talk about the details. These are the topics, and I'm going to be going through them. So they were already in the abstract, I believe, that some of you saw posted. So I'll just jump right in and start with this one, which was one of the earlier ones I did. So in the mid-2000s, there was this thing called the Millennium Development Goals. Now we have the SDGs. Well, the precursor was the MDGs, and I won't go into the distinction between them. But Jeff Sachs, who was running the Earth Institute at that time, tapped CSUN to be the data repository and the spatial data analysis arm of something called the Millennium Development Project, which was all about developing the strategies that would then lead to the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. So we came up with a lot of pretty cool data sets, and one of them was this global subnational data set on child malnutrition. It was one of the first of its kind. And so what I thought would be interesting to do is take that data set and then look at some of the geographic correlates of malnutrition in Africa. So this is the data set. Unfortunately, I have to say we haven't been able to update it. I did want to put a little plug in for those of you doing this kind of analysis that DHS has now made it much easier. The demographic and health surveys, not the Department of Homeland Security. The demographic and health surveys has made it a lot easier through their spatial data portal to basically download pre-processed grids. Essentially, they take their sample clusters and then they do spatial kriging. It's actually a Bayesian kind of kriging between the sample points to come up with surfaces for like child malnutrition or female education or other variables of interest to development practitioners. So at the time, though, this was a very painful process of matching demographic health survey and mix, which is multiple indicator and cluster survey data, to boundaries, and then building up a global picture of what that looked like. You can see there's still some gaps, like in the south of Sudan, and I think Congo Brazzaville is missing. This is the link. You can actually download the data set at this link if you want to go to do that. Most of this stuff, I'll leave the PowerPoint and can make it into a PDF, and folks can access that later if you want to get some of these links. But basically what I did was then converted a lot of these. So I had 367 subnational units for Africa, which is pretty good compared to like 40 countries, 40 or 50 countries. And what I was able to do is then generate a lot of spatial covariates or independent variables to test their relative influence or effect on child malnutrition. And some of them included water availability through water runoff, drought, frequency, elevation, agricultural constraints, the percentage of the population or proportion of the population, the subnational unit that was within, the proportion of the population within the subnational unit within 2 kilometers of a road, population density in those areas that were inhabited above a certain threshold. And each of these was then converted into the map you see at right. So in the upper left-hand corner, you see runoff. In the upper right-hand corner, you see the number of drought incidents. In the bottom left-hand corner, you see piped water. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you see transmission index of malaria. And some of these cluster pretty significantly. And so what I then did was run a standard OLS regression. And if you do, that, basically you see that almost every variable is highly significantly correlated with child malnutrition. But we know from Waldo Tobler's first law of geography that everything is related, but near things are more related than more distant things. And so a lot of spatial statisticians have begun looking at different models for correcting or adjusting for the effects of spatial autocorrelation. And so when I ran it through I did a bunch of other tests, Moran's eyes and other things to test for the level of spatial autocorrelation. It was very high. And when you actually run the spatial error model for these same sets of variables, most drop out as being significant. The only 2 that really ended up being significant at the end of the day were the level of drought or number of drought incidents over the essentially 20-year period prior to most of these surveys, and pipe water, which is a proxy really for level of urbanization, because in most of Africa, you don't have pipe water unless you live in a pretty urbanized and affluent area. And so those 2 ended up being significant, and then I talk a bit about the policy implications of that. But you'll notice there's also some of them change signs. So when you run the spatial error model, what originally was positive or negative correlation becomes positive. In some cases, the opposite occurs. Moving along, another early assessment I did was just using a data set that we developed on infant mortality rates, which I'll show you in a second. I was interested. I was doing more work at that time because I'd come out of IUCN, which is a biodiversity conservation group, international organization, and I was involved with groups of people who were working on the social aspects of conservation in protected areas around the world. And so I went to a workshop in Cambridge at the World Conservation Monitoring Center, and I started playing around with data that we had to look at the hypothesis of whether people who live closer to parks have higher levels of poverty than those who live on average in a country. And it may not seem like a very interesting question, but it was one at the time that seemed to be more urgent, because there were questions about whether parks were actually depriving local people of livelihoods, or whether in fact they were attracting new income and new opportunities because people would come for tourism and then pay locals to be guides and things like that. So we had this other major effort around the same time, also developed for the Millennium Development Project, which was to develop a global subnational data set of infant mortality rates. We've actually subsequently improved this. One thing I want to point out is all these maps that I'm showing you are CC BY or attribution only So these are open access maps you can download and use in your own presentations in our map gallery. So this data set has been superseded, and now we have a 2015 version with many more subnational units, higher resolution globally. But what I found doing this simple analysis, I essentially just took the centroid of each protected area and identified the infant mortality rate within that protected area. So each protected area was assigned an infant mortality rate. Then I averaged the infant mortality rates for the country as a whole, and I compared that to the levels of rates within the protected areas. And then I could do it by different class of protected areas. So basically, there was only a very modest difference between, if you look at the national rate on average in the low-income countries of about 88.8 infant deaths per thousand, in the all protected areas in the countries where those low-income countries, it was a little bit more, a little higher in the protected areas of about 89.6. And for the strictest protected areas, the ones that really have high conservation value and are basically off limits to people going in, they're only used for scientific purposes, they had rates of about 91.6. Similarly, the larger the protected area, the more the infant mortality rates were higher. And that suggested to me that basically they were in more remote, isolated areas with fewer health services and therefore higher levels of infant mortality. It wasn't like a ground-shaking result, but it was kind of contributing to this literature. And I think the strict protected areas had a similar factor where they were generally in more remote areas and therefore had similar issues in terms of health access and things. So turning again to another line of work that was actually instrumental in developing a number of data sets that we now disseminate at SEDAC, we got a NASA ROSES contract in 2009 or thereabouts. And we basically used the money they provided us to analyze the ability to develop policy relevant indicators using satellite remote sensing data across three major areas: ambient air pollution, coastal eutrophication, and biomass burning. And then we had what the paper actually really focuses more on what the advisory group advised us. So we had policymakers, we had remote sensing scientists, and they actually had very different views of what indicators should represent. And I can get into that later if you're interested in hearing more. But so what I consider these to be is like level 5 products. For those of you who are remote sensors, you basically know that there's this kind of levels of raw data coming right from the sensor, level 0, and then you go up the chain of processing until you get to essentially level 4, which is modeled data or variables derived from multiple instruments. And so those are things like, correct me if I'm wrong, Guido, but like leaf area index or various vegetation measures might be level 4. What I consider to be level 5, which is really not, it's my own made up term, so apologies there, but it's essentially policy relevant indicators that someone could take and use from a policy perspective and actually use them to make decisions or to allocate resources. So we started with this like multi-pollutant ambient air quality metric. We were looking at particulate matter, fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, and we were looking at nitrogen dioxide. These are traditionally measured by ground stations, but as most of you are aware, those ground stations are very sparse. So we have in a lot of the developing world, you might have 2 or 3 observations for a whole country. And so we wanted to see whether some of those gaps could be filled using remote sensing data. So we took the AOD or aerosol optical depth measures for PM 2.5, and then we used a geochem model to basically convert that to ground level measurements. This is basically based on work that a group at Dalhousie University led by Randall Martin and Aaron von Dankeller have developed. Then we took population data and we weighted that. That was a step that they never took. And basically the idea was to come up with by geographic unit population weighted measurements. The reason for that is you could have high levels of concentration in areas that are not very populated, or you could have them in very highly populated areas. Most often they coincide with highly populated areas. So to average PM 2.5 concentrations across China, for instance, without taking into account the fact that most of the people are breathing air in really heavily polluted areas would be give you the wrong picture. So this is a picture of like one time slice, 1 year of data, or it's probably a multiple year sort of composite showing levels of PM 2.5. Just for reference, the WHO standard for annual average concentrations that are harmful to your health is anything over 10 micrograms per cubic meter. This scale goes up to 135 micrograms per cubic meter. So that's quite a bit higher than the WHO standard. So you take that grid, you multiply it times this grid, and then do a population weighted average by country, and you come up with something like this. So in China, for instance, on average during this time period, people were breathing something like 55 micrograms per cubic meter or up, which is 5 or 6 times above the WHO recommended levels. If you go down to the subnational level, you get a more nuanced picture with like the New Delhi and the Ganges River Valley really popping out of northern India and parts of northern China really popping up off the map. Again, extremely high levels of concentrations. Most of you who've traveled to these countries are aware of the pollution problems. So we also can do things like trend analysis. So this is trend analysis looking at a time series from 1999 to 2011. We have more recent data, but we just didn't translate it into a trend map. And you can see areas where that problem is getting worse in much of Asia, and where it's getting better in places of North America and even parts of South America and Africa. And then we have, this is a most recent sort of snapshot picture we have. And in some of these areas, you see concentrations of upwards of 100 micrograms per cubic meter, or in other words, 10 times the WHO standards. We also did the same thing for coastal water quality. Much more complicated problem and much less tractable. But what we wanted to do is we realized that levels of coastal, gunk in the water, so this is using ocean color sensors, and the levels vary by different ecosystems. So some coastal systems, you might see a lot of algae, but that may be a natural part of its, natural component, at least seasonally, that it would have very high algae levels. In other parts of the world, you'd expect very low levels of concentration. So what we wanted to do is kind of remove that problem by looking at trends over time. So this is just masking out any areas with no significant change in concentration for the Gulf. And basically the area around the Mississippi Delta, for some reason, looks like it's cleaning up over that period. In other words, the trends are negative and it's getting better. Some parts of the Gulf along the Texas coast are getting worse, and then there's a sort of hot spot down along the Yucatan Peninsula. We had a very hard time interpreting these results, partly because the ocean is three-dimensional and there's transport down, with currents and things like that. And so it's nothing like the terrestrial environments. So our original thought was, oh, we're going to see real hot spots in China off the coast of like parts of in the Yangtze Delta or areas like that. And we never really were able to identify those kinds of hot spots. This is a picture of the coast of China, and you don't really see, this is, sorry, Vietnam, pardon me. I am a geographer. I do know where I'm looking at on the right side. We do have China somewhere, but I didn't put that map up. And maybe you see a little bit down along the lower, sort of the end of the Mekong. But that's an earlier data set that used a different methodology of just percent change in chlorophyll concentration. That one is available for download. So sort of based on that work, what we did is we started working with other data sets, like, so we have the PM 2.5. We also have nitrogen dioxide grids. Most of those are produced by Dalhousie University, or they all are produced by Dalhousie University. We also started processing data on land surface temperature, and we developed in the lower left-hand corner an analysis of a global urban heat island analysis, which basically took the summer maximum temperature for daytime and nighttime and looked at the temperature within urban areas and in the immediate 10 kilometers around urban areas for surface temperature, and then looked at that difference, and that's what you're seeing in that lower map in the lower left. Then there's, and that actually was just written up in a Nature publication, not our own. Somebody actually just took our data set off the shelf and then analyzed those data by various biomes and things. So it's kind of interesting. We had intended to do the same thing and we didn't get to it, and then somebody else did it, which is fine. We also took Matt Rodell's data from Goddard Space Flight Center, and he did some really interesting work with GRACE, looking at changes in water availability. What you see here is basically like Greenland, the water availability is a total water, including ice sheets, groundwater, and everything else, because they can measure all those layers from the gravity, the change in gravity, basically over an area. And so much of Greenland, you can see, is shedding ice mass, except for the very central part of Greenland. And then you have these large areas like the Ogallala Aquifer in Oklahoma and Texas that are bright red hotspots of water depletion, and then Southwest California. I'm going to run out of time if I keep going at this pace, so I'll keep going. So this is another sort of just subset of work. It's a kind of collection of different things that I was involved in. The map at the bottom was sort of one of the maps that was part of this paper that I looked at, comparing. It's one of the most cited papers that I have, and it basically looks at vulnerability of cities, and was one of the first ones to kind of come out looking at multi-climate hazard vulnerability and risk. There's a story behind the map at the bottom. I actually put the paper in for review and went to a conference, and someone who was a reviewer took the map and put it in his PowerPoint. So it was a kind of interesting case where you should never do that as grad students. It's not a good idea. He kind of looked a little red-faced when I went up to him later. This was some work we did for USAID, which ended up in a paper, in a chapter, which was in a report called the, it's complicated title, but it's Cynthia Rosenzweig produces this report every few years on urban climate risk and climate assessment. So this looks at, you know, the Bight of Benin and the Guinea Coast kind of in terms of risk to sea level rise, population change. So if you look at projected population in this region, extremely high in the lower right, and the Niger Delta was already identified by multiple papers as being like a hotspot of potential climate risk because of the very low elevations there and places like Cotonou, Benin. Keep going. This is some work we did with CARE and United Nations University and other partners to essentially map. And this is really what I would call maps as storytelling. So we made an extra effort to try to do good cartography. Cindy can critique us, I'm sure, on what our color choices are and things like that. But this is looking at like population density and some other base layers globally, and sea level rise in the Mekong Delta. And if you look at a 1 meter or 2 meter sea level rise, you're losing something like 30 to 40% of the rice growing area of that region. Plus, I don't know, I forget the number of people, but it's an awful lot of people who could be affected by that. This was in the same report called In Search of Shelter. And basically we looked at these major glacial areas, glaciated areas in the Himalaya, and the number of river basins that were dependent on those major ice sheets, or glaciers I should call them, and the potential that once they melt, you have a real problem with water supply for something like 1.4 billion people in today's terms. So then it's overlaid with these, it looks like measles, but they're actually urban areas according to our GRUMP data set. And the blue areas are all irrigated areas. So there's a lot of dependence on those, this kind of water tower of the world. My dissertation at ITC was on vulnerability mapping, so I've done a lot of publishing on that topic. One paper at the bottom, you'll notice, if it's not cut off, Carolyn Fish, who is a graduate from here, working with Bill McEachran, I think is in the audience, was a co-author on that paper. And some of the, again, using SEDAC data in combination, in this case, what I was interested in for one study was just looking at how you can combine remote sensing with socioeconomic data to make sense of what's going on in the environment and these socio-ecological systems in Mali, and how climate change might impact those. This was a study we did for the Foresight, UK Foresight, in around 2011, released a major report called Global Environmental Change and Migration, or Migration and Global Environmental Change, one or the other. They came to us very last minute in around 2009 or 10 I guess it was, and said, hey, we'd really like to have this study of net migration by ecosystems globally from 1970 to 2010. Could you do that for like $100,000? And we were kind of stupid enough to say, yes, we'll do that. And so we ended up taking it on, but it turned out to be one of the more interesting projects that we've done. And what we did is we took as a baseline this GRUMP. It's another population product that we produced, slightly modeled population product based on gridded population of the world. And we used a 1 kilometer resolution globally. And then we used this historical population data set called HIDE, which a group in the Netherlands produces. And it's at a very coarse resolution, but we use the HIDE data set to essentially backcast, because HIDE produces a time series from like 1800 to roughly the present, mostly for climate modeling purposes, but we use their rather coarse data to backcast our GRUMP data to 1970. So the basic, while I let that thing loop around, the basic method was then to take population at the beginning of the time period, say 1970, and then the population grid at the end of the period, 1980, and you subtract 1970 from 1980 and you have a change grid. And then what you need to do, though, in order to estimate net migration, is you actually need to subtract out natural increase. If you spread that natural increase across the entire country, then you're basically getting no differential whatsoever across the country. So we figured that actually there was probably some systematic pattern of natural increase between urban and rural areas within a country. And if we could capture that accurately, then we could actually create a spatially differentiated rate of natural increase grid. So you then take the 1970 data, population, you multiply it times that natural increase grid, and then you get your total natural increase. You get the natural increase for that time period, 1970 to 1980, and then you basically, the residual that's left over is your net migration. It's basically the population balancing equation, which I'll cover in a second. So we did, in fact, do a little analysis collecting as many rates of natural increase as we could. We basically, to get the difference between urban and rural rates of natural increase, we had to compile data from multiple sources going back to the 1970s. These were mostly population, I forget the names of the reports, but these are reports put out by the Population Division of the UN and the UN Statistics Division, I believe it is. And basically, we compiled this into a giant database. And what you would expect is if the world was, if the world, there were no difference between urban and rural rates of natural increase, that is births minus deaths, you would expect the ratio to be 1. But you can see that across this large N of about 900 samples, these are different times, dates, country year sample, basically. You see that only a small fraction actually have the same rates. Most developed countries may have slightly higher rates of natural increase in urban areas than rural areas, because rural areas tend to be older and they're slower growing. But the rest of the world, the vast majority of the world, developing world, the rates of natural increase are much larger in rural areas. There's higher fertility and higher rates of natural increase. So, and then you have these anomalies of negative ratios, because in some cases you have a negative rate of natural increase in some parts of the world. In other words, death rates are higher than birth rates, and so the rates are negative. So what we did was we did compile this massive database of rates of natural increase by urban and rural areas, 5,000 country year observations. And then we had to basically impute all the other country year observations that were missing. So we used two different approaches, MI and Amelia. Amelia is two different packages in R to basically impute the missing observations that we needed. And what you see is that if you look by decile of population density for the China, you see a pretty strong negative relationship between, so lower population density areas have higher rates of natural increase than high density areas. So your Beijings and Shanghais have very low rates of natural increase. But in the US, it's pretty much the opposite. Highly urbanized areas have higher rates of natural increase. I said this earlier, I'm just saying it again. So if you run a regression line through that, essentially what you get is you can essentially infer by the level of population density at the beginning of each time slice, you can infer the rate of natural increase based on each country relationship. So every country had a separate regression run for it, and then we could infer from the population density the rate of natural increase. If I thoroughly confused you now, I apologize. But then the point is, at the end of the day, you can use this reverse like population balancing equation to come out with a natural increase or net migration. So this is what the grids look like at the end of the day. Areas that are in red show positive change in natural net migration, and areas that are in blue show negative. And so largely negative areas of net migration are areas that are rural, more dispersed populations, and the red areas tend to be more urban, concentrated populations because that's the destination for many of these migrants. And this is across the different time slices. We do not have as much confidence in the 2000 to 2010 for various reasons, so we didn't analyze that in this paper. But essentially, what you see is then if you look at that by ecosystem, dryland ecosystems have lost populations consistently in every part of the world, especially in Asia, but also in much of Africa. So in other words, people have been migrating out of those areas. Whereas in North America, we're the counterfactual. Most people are moving into like Tucson, Arizona, and places like that where there's no water. Similarly, mountain ecosystems, every part of the world is losing population of mountain ecosystems. We're gaining population in parts of the Rockies and places like that. And then if you look at coastal ecosystems across the board, but especially in Asia, there's just massive increases in population in those coastal zones. All right, this is my last sort of piece of research, and then we can open it up for question and answer. This was an effort that we started in 2017 with the World Bank. I'll give you the backstory as I go through. Well, so the purpose was to essentially project future net migration due to climate change on a country-by-country basis. And we used real climate impacts, not changes in water, not changes in rainfall and precipitation. A lot of past work had basically looked at how climate variables like precipitation and temperature may affect migration. There's been some very sophisticated statistical analysis that informed some of our work, but nobody had been really looking at these new brands of data that are coming out of something called the Intersectoral Impact Model into Comparison Project, or ICIMIP. So ICIMIP has been collating and collecting data from around the world by modeling groups that are basically running GCMs, global climate models, through process-based models to come out with changes in water availability, crop production. They also have health models. They have forest ecosystem models. They have net primary productivity models. If you want a model in your sector, it's likely they've actually run a model in your sector. So we took two of those outputs, which is for future water availability and future crop production. We used these data sets from SEDAC to produce this report. The primary one was the gridded population of the world, which is in the upper left-hand corner. That was the baseline population for 2010. So that's what we looked at for future population distribution. We then did some, we needed to use urban extents because actually Brian Jones at CUNY Hunter, who's a geographer who does really good work, he was the modeler, the population gravity modeler who did the work behind this. And he does it all by urban and rural areas separately. Then at the end of the day, we use something called anthropogenic biomes to create something like a livelihood zone so we could analyze migration in the future into and out of livelihood zones. So this is the data set, and actually it's a data set we disseminate through SEDAC, which got me thinking about the possibility of looking at future migration under climate change. Brian has produced this globally gridded set of data set scenarios based on the shared socioeconomic pathways. And these are likely futures under a variety of assumptions related to income inequality, future economic growth. Those of you who are familiar with the old stress scenarios under the old IPCC, these are the new stress. This is kind of like what the world might look like from a socioeconomic systems perspective in the future. And so he had already generated these projections into the future out to 2100. And this is a data set that we disseminate. As I said, it uses a population gravity model, and each different scenario uses a certain set of assumptions about whether people are likely to move from a rural area to an urban area because of income differentials. They also have slightly different, assumptions about population growth nationally and things like that. And I said to Brian, hey, wouldn't it be interesting? I think this is really interesting that you projected the population out to 2100, but isn't that a little presumptuous to think that the world population is just going to evolve as if nothing else in the world is going to evolve, like climate change and climate impacts? Are people going to actually be able to live in some of these areas where you're saying the population will be so high or thus and so? So he said, that's a really good question. And it happened that I went to the bank for another workshop and I was presenting the work we did on the Foresight project, and I said, and they said to me afterwards, would you be interested in trying to do something similar but into the future? And that's when I talked to Brian and we came up with this somewhat half-baked idea of generating future population projections under climate change. So what we did was the standard population gravity model just uses essentially this idea of agglomeration effect. In other words, people tend to be attracted to urban areas, and you can actually use a gravity model to replicate past changes in population distribution, knowing that people move to where there's greater economic opportunities, there's jobs, there's educational opportunities, and there's more market services and things like that. And it's been proven you can do a pretty good job replicating the past. So what we wanted to do is look at whether you could change the environmental conditions and make places that were attractive become less attractive, or that were not so attractive become more attractive based on whether changes in water availability or crop production were actually affecting those areas. We also looked at sea level rise, but the way we implement sea level rise is not to really change the gravity model in terms of the attractiveness of each grid cell, but we look at it as a mask. It keeps people from moving into areas that were previously habitable. I won't get into the calibration and things, but for each, we ran 3 different scenarios with 4 model runs for each. This is the way the model works. It basically, for each grid cell, measures the population potential within that grid cell. Rural areas will tend to have lower population potential. Urban grid cells will tend to have higher population potential. And then within that time slice, which is usually a decade, you get a change in population, and you do it again for the next time slice. And then the idea was that the environmental changes would affect the relative attractiveness of these grid cells. So if you had a drought in, say, the upper left-hand quadrant here, you would probably see the potential decline even further than what's represented in this grid here. These are the kind of data that we ran through it. So these are future climate water availability projections, very simplified. We did not provide all the data here. We had to simplify a lot of the outputs. So what this is basically the relative to a baseline water availability, you have areas in dark blue that have roughly triple the water availability of the prior, the baseline period in the future between the period 2010 and 2050. Remember, these are areas in some cases that have maybe 10 meters of rainfall, 10 millimeters, or 20 millimeters, or 100 millimeters. So they're not, they might see a tripling, but it's only going to be maybe to 200 or 300 millimeters. The red areas are going to see maybe a halving. Dark red could see as much as 75% reductions in water availability. And these are across the 4 different model runs that I mentioned were inputs to the scenarios. In the interest of time, I'm just going to skip to some of the headline conclusions, which are basically that we could then, by looking, the way we did it was basically you look at the future population projection under climate change and the future projection without climate change, and the difference between those we assume was due to migration. So that difference was why we measured the climate migration. And so you could then sum up by grid cell the numbers of people that were the difference. And if it was negative, it was basically an area of out-migration. If it was positive, it was an area of in-migration potentially due to climate impacts. Very mechanistic, very high level. And we did our very best to couch this in those terms because we realized that some people may take exception to the idea that you can even do this. But it was a first cut, and it did actually engender some really interesting policy dialogues in countries, and has also engendered some backlash and some interesting dialogues among geographers and others. One thing I'll point out here is that the pessimistic scenario, which has highest emissions and the worst development outcomes, invariably had higher numbers of climate migrants than the other scenarios, including the more inclusive development scenario and the more climate-friendly scenario. The other thing to be very clear about, this is internal migration within each country. We're not measuring international migration. We're saying nothing about the likelihood of mass refugee movements from one country or one continent to another. That's not something that we definitely made clear in the report. That's not what we're talking about. You could also, because we were able to do this on a spatial basis, create these hotspots maps. So the red areas show areas of in-migration and the blue areas show areas of out-migration. And this represents 2 or more scenarios that agree and at the highest 5% increment or level in terms of the number of migrants. One thing that I'll just point out is that highland areas like the Lake Victoria Basin and parts of the highlands of Mexico show higher levels of in-migration, and the lowland areas typically show higher levels of out-migration. And I don't think that's purely coincidental. So if you want to see more work that's been done with SEDAC data, you can go to this database of all of the citations of every SEDAC data set. So there's hundreds or thousands of articles that are in there, and you can actually go through and look at different data sets and how they've been used. Here are my conclusions, but I'm kind of hoarse, and I think I went way beyond my time, so I'm going to stop there, and you can read those for yourself, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.